Episode 78. I said mixed drinks. These are not cocktails. 18th century social drinking. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at how people got together and tippled socially in the 18th century British colonies. Just as with the hot drinks of the day, ceremony around alcoholic beverages was also developing. Now that people had foundations on their houses and fenced gardens and stuff, it was time to stop quaffing sour pumpkin beer and sketchy raw rum out of leather tankards and get some cultural ready. Let's look at these totally not cocktails. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the commercial nature of the North American colonial venture meant we were ripe to develop into a hard liquor, ardent spirit, distilled alcohol, drinking culture. Good wine and beer and ciders of this age were all still agricultural products that were either drunk young and fresh as soon as they were ready and had a particular seasonal aspect to them, or they should be aged with patience, skill, and probably access to caves. Neither of these were major attributes of alcohol production in the 17th century British colonies, except maybe for the part where beer and cider was drunk as soon as it was ready. Back in England, Europe, and West Africa, there were traditions of making beers and other fermented beverages based on the turn of the seasons and for particular occasions. As America had gotten interested in the world again, we have rediscovered October and harvest beers, winter ales, and refreshing brews for the working day, like saisons. In wine, we've recently become aware of Nouveau Beaujolais, the fresh wine for the fall, with that funny little hint of fizz to it, and can treat as new the idea that some wines are to be drunk young and sweet, while others have to sit with their tannins to be tasty. The same way it used to be with apples. There was a lot of information about seasonal imbibing that was lost to the colonial and to the early American drinking world. The fact that almost all farming in the colonies and then America was linked to cash cropping of some kind meant that what alcohol we didn't imbibe from our own supply was also sold. Right from the jump, there were two goals that developed for what we brewed. One, it needed to keep so it could get shipped somewhere for sale, and two, it would be nice if it could be a predictable product. These two qualities will come to dominate American beer making almost the second we bring even the most rudimentary refrigeration into food production. But since we aren't there yet, these desires turn the 18th century British colonies into a market that prefers its booze potent. So they stay the way they started, with no fussy fussing with barrels and topping up and rotating and just getting fed up with the ridiculous summer temperatures just like everywhere. Which means in the 18th century, we had gotten pretty good at producing somewhat consistent rum and whiskey and even brandy. But a lot of it was, consistently bad, or what was known in the day as raw. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, because they hadn't pulled up stakes and moved recently, there were areas that were much further into the distilling game. I spoke of the nicer stuff that was being infused and even aged in religious communities, and let's face it, in the caves and cellars of families who had owned their land for a century or so, or more. Europeans and their thing about how young America is. One of the areas that really had it together when it came to distilling were the Low Countries, especially the Dutch states that centered around Amsterdam and Rotterdam and The Hague, ports and centers of commerce that they were. It is worth noting that these cities were rather at the European hub of all sorts of general technological innovation at this point. Printing, glassmaking, boat building, chemistry, map making, and yes, distilling. Spinoza wasn't just there because he could be philosophical about a bunch of religions without being tossed into a dungeon. He was also very into the physics of lenses, and Amsterdam was one of the few places that had the tech to make the glass for lenses he could grind to test his hypotheses and contribute to the world-changing microscopes and telescopes that were about to be the result of his meditations. But back to booze. I breathed a few words about the Bowles family when I touched on Curacao oranges back in episode 54, about how they were already a wealthy distilling and merchant house by the end of the 16th century. So by the 18th century, they were well into double distilling and distilling on an industrial scale. In the ages before mechanical refrigeration, industrial beer manufacture was not as profitable as it is now. The storage, transport, and seasonality issues of beer kept it either a local product or a specialty product. But industrial-scale distilling could be very profitable, especially as double and triple distilling were mastered. Continuous distilling is next century, and once that happens, well, watch out. Counterfeiting and debauchery at a grand scale rolls out. But here in the 18th century, it's all batch distilling. But double and triple distilling allows any flavor and character of the mash ingredients to be stripped out of the final product. When an alcohol-producing mash is single distilled, the hallmark of its origin remains. The amphitropic character of ethanol, one polar or hydrophilic end and one nonpolar or hydrophobic end, allows it to dissolve more chemicals than either water or oils. See bonus episode 35.5 on soap for more on that, and 42.5 on distillation for even more minutiae. But what that means is a first distillation and some second distillations will still show their origins, barley or corn or fruit or whatever. But another distillation or two will create a purer and more concentrated ethanol solution. This, incidentally, is part of the reason why many vodkas mention the number of distillations they've been through. The connection to their founding mash is more blurred and pushed into the distance. What the Dutch distillers were figuring out was how to make shelf-stable liquors from shelf-stable ingredients. To a certain extent, whiskeys and brandies and cognacs and sugarcane juice arracs were seasonal brews as they were made directly from agricultural products, grain and fruit and grass, which themselves have seasons. Rum, on the other hand, made from molasses, well, the molasses could just sit there for ages unchanging, and that had serious possibilities. But each of these liquors, once distilled in their pot stills, has distinct flavors. What if the corniness or the rye bite or the darkness and sweetness of rums or the fruit ghosts of brandies could be removed? And as time in the industry moves forward, those jumbled flavors of jumbled alcohols will be more regularly taken out. An alcohol that lacked any character of its own could be made into, well, anything. Thus the genevers and then gins were born. Neutral spirits were infused with all new flavors. Juniper was just there all the time, and the berries dry pretty well. From there, things like aromatic orange skins and dried caraway seeds seemed just natural. And soon, any number of aromatic and bitter combinations began to be added to make all sorts of liquors. They were usually consumed as aperitifs and digestifs, things to whet or sharpen the appetite or to aid in digestion. Just as with the ushkoba from the medicine section of the contemporary cookbooks, these flavored liqueurs and associated tinctures at this point were still rare and expensive enough to be mostly for the rich, or to be used with a purpose as medicine, or to make something celebratory or momentous for most everyone. In the 18th century, that would change, especially in England as Dutch neutral spirits technology moved in over and over again with returning soldiers. William Hogarth's Beer Street versus Gin Lane diptych was the classic kids these days on their phones visual alarm. Then as now, a new technology had focused underlying dysfunctions in society and created a powerful visual symbol for people to get all het up about. In both cases, the disturbing symptoms of disheveled, disrespectable, aimless people cluttering up the view have their underlying causes in structural problems with housing, education, and employment. But also in both cases, an uproar over the new technology is more politically satisfying, or at least better at grabbing attention. Then the tech was sugar and alcohol industrialization, now it's the social medias. But the human reactions are pretty much the same. And it wasn't just England that was getting an influx of cheap or cheaper neutral spirits in the 18th century. All around the sugar sphere of the Atlantic Ocean, distilling technology had been evolving since the 16th century. The entire technology economy that rotated around the iron and sugar trades, charcoal, shipping, shelf-stable calories for the workers, the sailors, and the customers, was driving all sorts of innovations. And so the production and then uses of neutral spirits from whatever plentiful materials were around began to grow around the edges of the Atlantic. In the Brazil that was New Portugal, sugarcane juice and other wastes were made into aguardente. In the Sugar Islands off West Africa, the Azores, Madeira, the Canaries, the Cape Verde Islands, and in the Caribbean where the Spanish had taken over, it was named almost the same Aguardente. Back on the Iberian Peninsula, bad wine and grape must that was made into distilled spirits was given those same catch-all names. And this name, in both Portuguese and Spanish, translates into burning water. Yeah, we all end up calling it fire water one way or another, even if we're all fancy with alchemical Latin and call it the quintessence or the fifth element. We all mean that water can become fire. So all of these spirits, neutral or not, on their own were not particularly fun to drink. People would drink them, yes, but the distillers making them wanted a way to get people to pay more for them, and medicines could only go so far. You can get people to pay a lot for medicines, but another technique is to make things taste good. And people will pay more often for something that tastes good. And this is how we finally get to the mixing of alcohols for a tastier and more fun social drinking experience. How far away can the tiny umbrellas be? Well, they're on the other side of ice machines. But you'll see how they were practically made inevitable by the 18th century. As with everything else in the 18th century, there were rich people versions of mixing alcohols and mixed drinks, and regular people versions of mixing alcohols and mixed drinks. So let's take a look at what they were, who drank what, and maybe even consider what versions you might want to try, possibly with a little updating. Some are definitely a hard no at any age, and some, well, probably would work just fine in more or less their original form, but you're allowed to use updated glassware. Let's begin with fortified wine, because I think this is really where the mixing of alcohols started. When I was a tiny child in the 1980s, fortified wine was a dirty word. It seemed to only refer to things like MD 2020, Thunderbird, and sherry of such a low quality that it was deemed cooking sherry, and then there was that bottle in the cupboard used to make chicken marsala. An aside, growing up as Indian food entered the American food lexicon, the difference between chicken marsala and masala chicken is its own whole episode on continued ignorance due to embarrassed confusion. See, Google was an almost unambiguous good for about the first 10 minutes of its existence. Anyway, by the end of the 20th century, the entire legacy of fortified wine and how it was amongst the most refined drinks for the most refined people had been completely done in by Prohibition. And I'll get to all that in a few seasons. But here's where things stood in the 18th century. Shipping wines in the 18th century was a well-established crapshoot. The likelihood of getting a wine from the caves of the vineyard to a merchant's or buyer's cellar before the darn thing had been ruined through a combination of agitation on the ocean, a wide range of temperature fluctuations as it moves from the quayside to ship to overland transport was unbelievably thin. If only there was some way to defend the noble flavors of the grape and the efforts of the vintner. Turns out there was. Add more alcohol. As I've mentioned once or twice, ever since distillation has been taken up, people noticed that alcohol was a strong preservative. So why not add a little extra alcohol to keep wine from souring? And thus, a whole range of fortified wines were born. These, of course, were especially popular in warm climates because that's where the wines were being made and would go sour faster. And because distilling the bad wines into these sorts of neutral brandies salvaged value out of a bad batch. Fortified wines were popular in cold countries because they would arrive after a whole long boat ride and overland trip still tasty. And they could be savored. That barrel of port or Madeira or sherry wasn't going to go bad on you. So it made it worth the price. And so the 18th century North American British colonies fell in love with Madeira. They liked sherry and port too, but those were further away and tended to get all tied up in European politics when trying to leave for the New World. Thus, they were more expensive and rare. But Madeira, coming from the Portuguese islands just west of Morocco, were just that little bit closer and away from most of the European squabbling. Vermouth-like potions were also around, but they tended to be homegrown versions. Made with imported bad wines, which were re-fermented with the addition of a little sugar, had some local brandy tossed in, and then were infused with local botanicals. This meant they were usually classified as medicines rather than as classy drinks, though it also meant they might be imbibed socially as an aperitif or digestif. For health, But as these were all wine drinks, and at least some part of them was imported from Europe, or at least from across the Atlantic, they were definitely rich people fare. In still rather genteel and somewhat upscale places, punches, flips, toddies, possets, cobblers, shrubs, sangarees, bounces, syllabubs, juleps, and wassails were also to be found. Many of these, while not exclusively rich people drinks, were still a better class of drink, since they require heating or maybe even baking and some fairly nice ingredients like dairy, eggs, sugar, and spices. But there are even more that were grubby pub fare. Wassail was a seasonal drink found in the winter around Christmas-type celebrations, and versions can easily be found even now. A lower alcohol something, cider, wine, or ale, was fortified with a brandy and was sweetened, partly with sugar and partly with cooked fruit. Apples were very popular at the time, and the whole thing was heated with some warming spices floating in it. This was a drink to be made when a crowd was expected. The sugar and fruit and spice could be used to nicen up otherwise marginal alcohols. Juleps, in the days before the easy availability of pebble or even chipped ice, were more of an early-in-the-day pick-me-up. Whiskey mixed with sugar, water, and a crushed herb concoction, usually fronted by the easy-to-find garden mints, was seen as a great way to get the day going, especially when there was a group of men politicking or building or hunting. The ice was only added later and used as a status symbol once sugar was just kind of everywhere. While those are fairly simple and straightforward drinks, there was another set that required a certain amount of kitchen pre-setup. They would be served at table for a formal dinner or at least part of a formal ball or other party, such as an ambassadorial reception or a welcome for some other visiting dignitary. This category included syllabubs, which were a bit of a show-off drink. They required a cook and fresh dairy. The closer to the cow, the better. A sweetened wine or cider or ale base was mixed with warm, fresh milk, or a heated cream and milk mixture to make a soft, curdled dessert. The use of the very fresh dairy is what made this a show-off drink, as did its immediate nature. It couldn't sit around for even a minute. It was made in front of the diners usually and consumed immediately. I know we have a hard time picturing this as tasty because tastes change over time, but a cold version of the syllabub is still popular in England, but it's made with whipped cream and tart jellies. Another fancy people beverage were the bounces, which are easy to understand as popular drinks. The raw spirits of the day were mixed with fruit syrups, sugar syrups that had fruits infusing them. Cherry bounce was particularly popular, and the whiskey mixed with cherry syrup and maybe a preserved cherry as well, this realistically is just a splash of bitters away from being a classic old-fashioned. And with the prevalence of different aromatic bitters or tinctures being used in these mixed drinks to tame unpleasant flavors, it's likely that more than one cherry bounce could have been enjoyed in such a way. Then there were sangarees, which absolutely sounds like a muddled version of sangria, and very likely was. The colonial and English versions were sherry or Madeira wine mixed with sugar and citrus juices and slices. It was likely a way to sell not-so-great sherry to the crowd that carried cash by mixing it with other fancy ingredients, the sugar and lemons or citrons or bitter oranges or limes. Since the regular wines of Spain were generally not available, this souped-up one, with a fortified wine in its place, was the New World version. Shrubs and cobblers are more or less cousins of one another. A shrub was either a sweetened vinegar or sweetened rum and vinegar base flavored with fruits. During Prohibition, the vinegar-only version remained, and the alcoholic version fell out of favor. Making your own tasty shrubs doesn't take that much work, just a little practice at balancing the sweet and the sour, and they are refreshing with soda water. A cobbler was simply a drink made by adding a shrub to some other rather inferior wine, or cider, and possibly some of the fruit that had been infusing the shrub. Or, if things were really fancy, maybe some fresh fruit. Cobblers were also drunk in England and would sometimes use the white or fino sherries of Spain in place of the wine, something that's worth trying even today. Possets were sickroom drinks and administered to ladies who were feeling nervous or poorly. So they often appear as the drink brought to a nervous bride or a new mother or a woman who has retired to her room with a headache. Men definitely drank and continue to drink possets as well, but this is just a literary quirk. Possets were an acceptable alcoholic delivery device for women, while straight shots of booze were certainly not. The most well-known posset we have today is, of course, eggnog, at least when it's made with the egg yolk and sugar base, and then the cream or milk are added, and you don't stint on the whiskey and brandy. To make it true eggnog, don't forget the nutmeg. However, I have to say that many a modern manufactured eggnog goes overboard on the nutmeg flavoring, so think moderation, not excess. The increasing popularity of Puerto Rican coquito, along with Mexican rompope and Cuban crema de vie, shows that a sweetened fatty base with warming spices stiffened up with this strong local alcohol is a popular choice wherever sugar is around, so the spirit of the posset lives on. So those are the fanciest drinks. If you left the fancy ballrooms and dining rooms and went on to go drinking at a local tavern or meeting house, there was likely to be less wine, fortified or otherwise, and more consumables of local manufacture. Punches, flips, and toddies all fall into this range, though of course punch was a great catch-all that could appear at balls, routs, clubs and reunions, military messes, and taverns. That, of course, is because punches by their very nature can be so many things, plain and straightforward or fancied up with spices or citrus or dairy. Even my own experience with punch is such that I knew a punch was going to be fun when a block of sherbet was melting in it, or they used real 7-Up, or it had an ice ring made in a bundt pan and someone had frozen fruit slices into it. But to bracket the punches of the 18th century, let's look first at the low end. Because punch had had 100 years to become blasé, what started out as a clubby drink for the inset, or at least the British military, had leaked out to everyone else. So some version of the classic rum, tea, sugar, water, citrus combinations could be found anywhere. But in the 18th century, while the rum and water always stayed, the tea was optional. The sweetener could be sugar, but also might be molasses or maple syrup, depending on location. The citrus could be there too, or it might be swapped out for vinegar. Then there was the middle, where all the ingredients were there, mixed to make something flavorful and likely of decent quality. At the top of the punch scale and moving back into clubs and parties were milk punches. These were associated with the syllabub, but not so fancy. While extremely fresh and higher fat milk mixtures were used to create tasty soft curds in the syllabubs, in milk punches, the freshness of the milk wasn't quite as important because the curds were always strained out. Milk punches were generally the local liquor, sugar, milk, tea, and maybe a little juice, spice, or fancy flavoring like rose water. And before anyone says, ew, gross, it's important to understand that the dairy had a job in these clarified or strained milk punches. There was the belief that mixing the harsh spirits of the day with an acid and then the dairy washed them or pulled out some of the parts likely to give the worst hangover. So the inevitable curds that were formed were also strained out and not consumed. And then the parts of the milk that didn't curdle, mainly some sugars and some other interesting flavored stuff, definitely gave a smoothness to the punch that the raw spirits of the day desperately needed. Flips became such a popular beverage that an entire iron fire utensil was created for them. Served in a mug or tankard, a flip was a sort of manly posset. The existence of the flip is also an indicator that the country was just richer and not hanging on by its fingertips as it had been in the last century. Flips are best made in pottery or metal mugs and tankards rather than leather or wood ones. And they require an egg, so egg supplies must have been pretty good for them to feature in a tavern beverage that even pretty ordinary guys could regularly indulge in. An ale base would have rum and an egg added. The egg would be beaten with a few twigs or a spoon. Nutmeg would be grated in, and then a special something would be added when a red-hot poker, or something called a flip dog, was plunged into the concoction. The flip dog was a special purpose utensil. While a fire poker might have ash or grit on it, the flip dog was a long fire iron with a small disc or ball on the end that was special purpose, heated up, and then plunged into the drink. Because it only had this one job, it wouldn't face the grit problem. And it was also shaped to place the most hot iron in the drink and do a better job. The egg and nutmeg made it a somewhat fancy drink of the day, but the egg also made it a bit of a pick-me-up, a hot drink with some extra virtue. In the same place as the flip was the tod, or toddy, another hot drink meant to get a sagging sole back into forward motion. While the flip was more of a general restorative, the tod was often called for when one had a bit of a head, or a bit of a chest, what we think of as a cold. Whiskey with a sweetener and usually some sort of tonic ingredient to chase away the ailment would also be incorporated. Mint, lemon balm, or other herb that had desirable curative properties might go in, or vinegar, or some part of a citrus fruit if it happened to be around. The modernish version of honey, lemon, whiskey, and hot water was explained to me as NyQuil before there was NyQuil. And since that go to sleep when you have a cold medicine didn't appear until 1966, there was definitely a lot of time for the toddy to become popular for just such a thing. After the toddy, the mixed drinks become less impressive and start to approach the complexity and sophistication of rum and coke or gin and juice, though generally more alcoholic and rough. And some had a bit of the soda fountain train wreck or kitchen sink feel to them, where you would just add all the other things you had around for a bit of variety. The combination of cider and ale was common, as was cider and rum. That one was sometimes known as a stone fence. Something called rattle skull was a combination of the local dark ale, some rum, and maybe a bit of citrus or vinegar to somehow change the flavor up. In an effort to get sailors an alcohol ration to keep down the griping, but still keep them sober enough to, do sailor stuff, versions of what would become known as grog, rum, water, and a sour element were being concocted. If it was a fancy day, the king's birthday, or you were crossing the equator, or maybe the cheese had run out, bumbo might be made up. That was a mixture of rum, spice, and sugar. And these easy-to-make concoctions definitely were made up in dockside bars as well. And then there was a drink so common it didn't really have a name. It was where somebody would slide up to the bar and ask for this liquor or that, and then request that a bit of sugar, maybe diluted with some water, and a preferred tincture of a semi-medicinal provenance should be added in. Everyone familiar with the tavern world and with adequate coin to purchase drinks fancier than the local ale did something like this. In fact, this liquor, water, sugar tincture was such a long-standing tradition that by the 19th century, wanting one's liquor doctored up this way might be considered rather old-fashioned. So in the 18th century, when we drank alcohol, we were very much a mixed drink nation. Not only were we becoming a nation of ardent spirits, rather than one of fine wines and carefully tended local ales, we were also laying the groundwork to be super ready to deal with the future scourges of bathtub gin and smuggled Everclear. Next week, I will be looking at the expanding botanical edibles of the 18th century. While there are plenty of edible plants all over the 18th century North American colonies still wanting to be appreciated by the colonists are so over that. They'd picked up corn and squash out of desperation and developed tobacco out of frank greed. And that was enough New World foraging. Time to bring more of the world to our new digs. Why discover what's around at your doorstep when fashionable, intriguing, and possibly profitable goods from around the world beckon? It's time to look at pre-America's first foray into global fusion foods. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. I really am enjoying hearing from listeners about the books they've run across. If I've already read it, you have great taste. If not, and this is really the most common thing, there are a lot of books out there and I really thank you. And any kind words you leave on your favorite podcast widget are appreciated as well. Your own impressions offer more ways to explain just what I'm doing here. The ongoing bibliography is almost up, and the blog will, someday, also get caught back up. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio, and I've been slowly waking up the account over on post.news, should everything burn down over here one day. It's all at THOA Food and in the show description.